Blog Talk Radio.
My grandmother was a wonderful person. She taught me how to play the game Monopoly. She understood that the name of the game is to acquire. She would accumulate everything she could, and eventually she became the master of the board. And eventually, every time, she would take my last dollar, and I would quit in utter defeat. And then she would always say the same thing to me. She'd look at me and she'd say, "One day, you'll learn to play the game." One summer, I played Monopoly with a neighbor almost every day, all day long. And that summer, I learned to play the game. I came to understand the only way to win is to make a total commitment to acquisition. I came to understand that money and possessions, that's the way that you keep score. And by the end of that summer, I was more ruthless than my grandmother. I was ready to bend the rules if I had to win that game. And I sat down with her to play that fall. I took everything she had. I destroyed her financially and psychologically. I watched her give her last dollar and quit in utter defeat. And then she had one more thing to teach me. Then she said, "Now it all goes back in the box. All those houses and hotels, all the railroads and utility companies, all that property and all that wonderful money. Now it all goes back in the box. None of it was really yours. Houses and cars, titles and clothes, bulging portfolios, even your body. Because the fact is that everything I clutch and consume and hoard is going to go back in the box, and I'm going to lose it all." You have to ask yourself, when you finally get the ultimate promotion, when you make the ultimate purchase, when you buy the ultimate home, when you have stored up financial security and climbed the ladder of success to the highest rung you can possibly climb it, and the thrill wears off, and it will wear off, then what? How far do you have to walk down that road before you see where it leads? Surely you understand. It'll never be enough. So you have to ask yourself the question, what matters?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Ben McLeish of the Zeitgeist Movement with this week's ZM Global Radio Show. We run a weekly radio show by different coordinators and different speakers within the Zeitgeist Movement to update news and discuss particular topics. Some of those can be to do with the actual coordination of the work the movement does, how it's organized, or advice in that arena. It can be on particular topics such as economics, environmental issues, and everything else that we speak about. Every now and again it's an interview. We've recently interviewed Maya Borg, Bernard Lietaer, who was behind the creation of the euro, for example, and many others, in an attempt to try and introduce a little bit more rationalism and rationality into the way that the world economy presently functions. To put it briefly, for any new listener, our movement advocates the broad implementation of harmonizing and socially, environmentally cohesive technologies, energy, transport, housing, maximized to their peak efficiency possible at the time to improve the welfare of the planet and of the people on it. It has to be both. It can't be the planet and not the people, because there's nothing good about that. It doesn't work. That's not something that's going to be leading to healthy human beings, or happy human beings, or indeed safe technologies and lower and more robust public health. Let's put it that way. In envisioning such a society, in extrapolating the logical train of thought that is involved in assessing our planetary lifestyle and our planetary resources and how it may be organized to benefit the billions that are in attendance and are awaiting their birth, if you like, the ones that are in the immediate future as well as the ones that are now here, there are several talking points, several themes which one cannot get around and which are inevitable in the possible transition to what we call a resource-based economy or a natural law resource-based economy. What is natural law? We're talking about the actual operation of real life as opposed to assumed economic laws or rules or laws that have been in place, or cultural memes and cultural mores which have been inherited down essentially and which may be based more on myth than we realize, or may have once been true but have now been surpassed by the inauguration of new technologies and the new developments that have happened. Some of these themes are, ultimately we are looking at the need for the removal of the monetary system. Why is that? Well, at the moment we can see that society itself is being retarded by a model of operation which benefits those who can remain in power for as long as they can, remaining in power in terms of literally in politics, or more importantly, I would argue, and something that actually I think probably has more of an effect than even political stalling, and that is the incumbent technologies and the incumbent establishments need to be bypassed in order for new advents to really be applied. I'll give you a very concrete example. The electric car has now been hamstrung for at least, it seems like 15 years. I mean, it's a long time. It's almost an entire generation of people that could have now already been on electric cars. Electric cars, of course, still requiring sustainable energy, which, of course, is another incumbent system problem. The development, the proper sustainable development of these kinds of systems has been conclusively shown to be stalled by large companies who either buy up all the rights to solar or wind or tidal, or just the simple non-funding or marginalization of new energy or battery technologies and all the rest of it. That's the first thing, is that the need to earn money, the need for cyclical earnings means that we are slowing down our innovation to a degree that makes it rather dangerous when it comes to sustainability. It makes transition difficult, it makes it messy, it makes it expensive in both immediate financial cost and in fact in the long-term cost of lives as well. And on the other side, any creation of the technologies, any implementation of the technologies we have now is according to cost. It's according to what can be afforded rather than what actually works. What is the correct, quote, correct way of implementing this technology properly? What's the real use of a desalination plant, for example? Where can it really be? How can it really work? Can it work, for example, on just using the sun's energy to filter out clean water from salt? Or is it maybe a combination of that and something else? At the moment, this goes largely untested due to the fact that it's much cheaper and easier in the short term to produce something quickly that works suboptimally. This is true of consumer technologies, housing, transportation, infrastructure, energy, education, everything. Everything is working. Everything you're surrounded by is working suboptimally, and you don't realize most of the time because you have nothing to compare it to. So that's one of the reasons we want to surpass the monetary system. The other one, which I won't dwell on in this episode, it's just a nice overview for new people, is that we are, in fact, looking by certain statistics, annihilating the job market in ways that traditional economists are not simply trained to understand. Federico Pistone, who's a member of our movement, wrote a book called Robots Will Steal Your Job, But That's Okay. And one of the most important statistics in it is that the percentage of people in work at all in a society has been dropping for 20 years. That is, the millions of people of a certain society that actually have jobs. So, for example, stay-at-home mothers, stay-at-home fathers, the retired, the young, and the generally unemployed, or the disabled and therefore unemployed, now form a larger group than they did before, not just in the number, but in the proportion. And this is true of a great many countries. The countries are listed in Federico's book. In other words, we're starting in a very slow way to do more with less, which is a phrase used by Buckminster Fuller, the futurist from the 1950s, who explained that through the gradual, what he called ephemeralization of technology, that is, using less and less materials to create more and more and more output in terms of energy, product, strength, tensile or torsion strength, everything can go in that direction, and if embraced, could have a quantum leap kind of effect upon global societies. So the job market is disappearing. Why is it disappearing? Well, precisely because of that ephemeralization, because artificial intelligence is now at unimaginable levels compared to 20 years ago, and in 5 years will be unimaginable compared to today, and so on. The power of technology is increasing. It's increasing at essentially an exponential level. We double the knowledge, we double the amount of information that we know about the human brain every year. We double the number of gigabits transferred, the number of gigabytes transferred, or transfer rate in bits of the internet every year. The large elements of all of this are doubling. Computers can shrink by a factor of 2 every year as well, whilst getting twice as quick, and of course twice as cheap. In other words, we're heading for an area where technology is becoming deeply embedded in our lives and can do a lot for us, a huge amount for us, to the point at which we make the case technology can actually replace a lot of what traditional economics has until now been doing. This is an argument which needs to be addressed. It is still considered to be a myth by a lot of traditional economists, precisely because it undermines the entire assumed structure of traditional economics. And the first thing that is ever done to any idea that threatens the established status quo is it is attempted to be discredited as not real. Well, unfortunately, the evidence that you can find in a book called The End of Work, or Federico's book, or The Lights in the Tunnel by Martin Ford, or by McAfee's book Race Against the Machine, rather than Rage Against the Machine. All of these books have a great many statistics that need to be addressed, and cannot be addressed by simply quoting some early 20th century thinker, or even better, some late 19th century thinker, who quite simply didn't have to deal with this kind of information. This is a general theme that we talk about. Now, on the social sciences side of things, our movement talks a great deal about causation of human behavior and not human nature. Human nature comes from the assumptions, mostly from a religious prehistory that we've grown out of, that our culture has been birthed in. Traditional theory in this regard is that, of course, morality comes from God and comes from religion, and that goodness needs to come from human beings. You need to be a good person. You need to recant and stop being so sinful, and just pull yourself together, please. And then we can progress and become brothers and sisters with one another. Of course, modern social science does understand and has understood for a very long time in lots of very, very powerful ways that the causation of human behavior does come from its surrounding society. I could be facile about this and say that it is precisely because you and I, dear listener, have a certain cultural memes in common that means that we can understand each other. Right? The language I'm using is a cultural product. It's something I inherited. If I'd been born in Iran, I wouldn't be speaking English. I'd be speaking Farsi at least, and or if I was born somewhere else. This seems like a stupid point, but saying that human values are somehow human nature, it comes from you, it emanates from you, would mean that if I were born in a country that is not of the country I'm in now, I'd have still grown up speaking English, even if everyone around me is, for example, speaking German. In fact, I was born in Germany, and of course I grew up speaking both languages. But this is the same as saying that. It's to say that if you flew a baby from China to America and let it grow up there, it would somehow grow up Chinese. It wouldn't, of course. This is, of course, also true of the kinds of crimes that are committed, or the kinds of economic or fiscal or environmental attitudes that we have, or the general tenets of all of this stuff are inherited, or they are culminated through various social pressures, be they a general level of stress, a general pre-existing level of crime, a general acceptance of corruption within your government. We need only look at Turkey and Greece for recent examples of where a country is faced with a very different set of political or economic problems, and how that affects and has affected the culture in the past and will do so in the future. And yet, despite all of that seemingly rather obvious stuff, I'd imagine you're probably nodding your head thinking this is fairly obvious, nevertheless, when the media gets its hands on the stories that I'm about to mention, particularly, for example, the story of Ariel Castro, a man who has imprisoned Amanda Berry and two other people in America in his house secretly for 10 years. As soon as he comes out, there is a general tone in the media that says that he is evil and he did it, and there's essentially no causative mechanism. It even comes out that Castro's daughter is in prison for 25 or 28 years for slashing her baby's throat. Even then, the causative mechanism is still not talked about. It's merely couched in terms of just when you thought it couldn't get worse, this gentleman who abused these people like Fritzl did in Austria has a daughter who's also evil. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's about time that the media grew up and started talking about what it is that makes these people behave this way. And simply calling them evil or simply calling them any name doesn't give you any information about the causative mechanisms, what might be going wrong, in other words, how this might be avoided, an insight into human behavior, a valuable insight, because you can't organize tests for this stuff. So when they're discovered, they need to be studied in this way and not simply locked away. And let's hope that it doesn't happen again before in 2 or 3 years we discover yet another story. Ariel Castro, by the way, of course, is not even the first case. Fritzl in Austria, Joseph Fritzl did exactly the same thing. There was a gentleman in California, I think it was. I do apologize if I've got that wrong. There have been 2 or 3 stories recently, like in the last 3 years, that are exactly the same. And every time I hear this story, every time this is in the media, another monster with a dungeon of terror, I always think to myself, how many are there that we have not discovered yet, they are trapped now, tonight. They are in that prison. And we wring our hands about their evil nature, and yet don't maybe think that it might be a reorientation of values that could actually prevent this, rather than, hoping until they accidentally get freed, or even worse, die in captivity, and it's only years later that they're even discovered. About a week and a half ago, a soldier leaving Woolwich barracks is driven over deliberately by 2 men who claim to be Muslim converts, and who then step out of the car and behead this man in broad daylight. Onlookers, not seeing the beheading so clearly, nevertheless think that he is being given mouth-to-mouth or resuscitation because the men are crouched over him. In reality, the 2 perpetrators of this crime were eviscerating this man, and stood around calmly, semi-calmly, talking to onlookers with blood-stained hands about how this happens every day in other countries. And so they somehow use that to justify the idea that therefore it needs to happen one more time in another country. However, as they get led away, again the media gets filled mostly from the right-wing contingents of British politics and pseudo-politics through the English Defence League, the EDL, and the British National Party and the UKIP party, who all tend towards a more separatist view and uphold the idea of nation-states and countries, and fear of integration with others, and usually cultural norm arguments that are being sent out as well, and use this to capitalize upon attacking the Muslim population as if this were some sort of standard response that any Muslim would do. Fire bombings have happened across Britain, the usual stuff that always attends these kinds of events. And again, we hear a lot of this rhetoric about evil, about it being the problem of or the responsibility of the individual, and all the rest of it. Now, in trying to discuss the values that the Zeitgeist Movement discusses, we focus quite a lot of our energy on causation. One of the best sources for this is actually many of the lectures by Matt Berkowitz, who works in our Vancouver chapter, who himself has given a lot of time to explaining causation. We come out of a prehistory and of a recent history where, for a great deal of time, religion was and is the backbone of morality. It claims to even be the source of morality as well, in which it is asserted that morality somehow needs to stem from the individual. It needs to be down to self-control, discipline, good behavior, and essentially puts forward the argument that if the individual looks after themselves and behaves in a way that is responsible, the Americans would call it working hard and playing by the rules, then the society will be fine. Now, of course, this is actually the other way about when we understand modern social theory. And to that effect, and to that end, I want to read in full, it takes about 28 minutes to read, an essay by Chapman Cohen, who's now an unknown gentleman who, during the 1920s and 30s, and even the 40s, was a leading force and, in fact, the head of the National Secular Society of Britain. He was of Jewish descent, but made forceful, powerful, and often humorous arguments against the incumbent idea that religious doctrine is the source of good, and in fact, actually, through an analysis of this, provides actually a very useful essay which explains behavioral causation and where it logically must come from. It must be, before I read this, it must be pointed out that Chapman Cohen was writing very, very early in the 20th century. He was writing in the late 20s and the 1930s. And yet, when you hear the essay I'm about to read, you'll notice that a great deal of what he is talking about has been absolutely borne out by even the most recent findings in social science about causation, about what informs human behavior, and what has ultimately become one of the backbones of what the Zeitgeist Movement talks about, that the value orientation is this emerging quality that isn't just down to the individual, and is in fact culminated by a particular social order, which sometimes has causative mechanisms that actually have, on the face of it, nothing to do with moral values. They seem to be economic ones, or they seem to be technical ones. And this, I think, will provide a useful backdrop by reading this essay to delve into this. And I'll make a few points once I've read the essay as well. Thankfully, I recorded this essay before my voice went, so for the next 30 minutes, my voice will be slightly better than it is at the moment, but then I'll pick up afterwards and run through what I think are a few key points that will help us decode, or help listeners at least decode, or try and reorientate the kind of baffling piffle that you hear in the media, the way that people are described, in often very emotional terms as evil, despite the fact, of course, the acts in here are awful. The acts that are described by Ariel Castro and by people like the two Michaels from the Woolwich incident, and by the numerous people who seem to be abducting and killing girls and women. There seems to be a new story of this every week. These are, of course, terrifying and awful and regrettable behaviors. It gets us nowhere at all to call them evil. It does not explain why they did it. It doesn't give us any source of where the problem might be resolved. Instead, it just condemns or condones, depending on whether you use the terms good or evil. A few points on Cohen's essay, which is called Monism and Christianity. Now, I'm reading an essay that is in response to an article by a Christian, I believe it was a bishop of some kind, or a vicar. But the focus isn't really to do with being a critique of religion, but in this sense, it is a critique of the logic of where values come from. So even though you'll hear a lot of it mentioning Christianity, this is true of the general religious worldview, as it was then, and I think as it still continues now. As I said, it was probably being written in the early 1930s, and I'll give a definition of monism as well. It's a word that I hadn't been familiar with, but is in fact very common in the religious discourse. Monism is the understanding, or let's say it's roughly speaking, a view of life which considers everything as one holistic, interconnected plane. Now, both Buckminster Fuller's world game and the sort of Spinozistic pantheism is similar to this, in the sense that it's a very broad, interconnected view of traditionally separately seen elements. We think of the environment, and we think of trees, and we think of air, and we think of current flows and water and all the rest of it. We don't think of the fact, not always, of the interconnectivity of the human world with the environment. It is all one environment. This is also to do with the complex inner psychological life of humans, which sort of also provide an environment to other humans that they're interacting with. That's not considered in the environment either. As modern science has learnt to work through matter and learn about the building blocks and atoms and quarks, we've gradually realized that the prior gaps that we've perceived in reality have really just been gaps in our understanding. And that's a point that's actually specifically made by Cohen. But this is what monism essentially is. It's all one big thing that can be understood as one whole element. There is no design to it. There is no intervention by a deity. There is no unique source of anything. There are consequences which flow from first principles. So that's a background to what that means. He also is referencing an article written which attacks the worldview, but enough of this article is actually quoted in the essay itself to provide context without having to explain it. However, you'll notice that the central criticism that this article has evidently made, judging by Cohen's response, is that if you consider a monistic view of life, in other words, a one interconnected view of life, you are forced to apparently only think about the human race as a collective and not the individual. The individual is annihilated. This is a charge that we have seen quite a few times. Those who decide that we're collectivists, for example, or those that think that the individual is absolutely erased in something that's great for the whole but not for the individual. This essay will prove to be quite useful in that regard. So look out for that. I'll return to it once I've read it. And he also very briefly at the outset mentions a gentleman called Charles Bradlaugh. Charles Bradlaugh was a famous 19th century and early 20th century atheist who set up Britain's National Secular Society, which Cohen was actually at the head of, as I mentioned. That's all he is. He only gets mentioned once, and it doesn't really matter. So without any further ado, here is Chapman Cohen's Monism and Religion, and I'll return after this to digest a few points and try and apply them to what we're seeing at the moment within the discourse that always attends tragedies and crimes which I think in a way retard our ability to effectively fix or locate the problems which have led to the crime. Here is Chapman Cohen. Monism and Religion by Chapman Cohen. It was a sound instinct that led the religious world to brand the pantheism of Spinoza as atheism. Equally sound was the judgment of Charles Bradlaugh in resting his atheism upon a monistic interpretation of nature. Every intelligible theism involves a dualism or a pluralism, while every non-theism is as inevitably driven, sooner or later, to a monism. With an instinct sharpened by perpetual conflict, the churches saw that, no matter the terminology in which the monism is disguised, its final outcome is atheism. For the essence of the atheistic position is not the establishment of any particular theory of matter, or force, or volition, but that, given a first principle as a starting point, all else follows as a matter of most rigid necessity. It thus dispenses with interference, or to use a favourite mystifying expression of Sir Oliver Lodge, guidance, at any step of the cosmic process. To call the monism advocated a spiritual monism does not alter the fact. It only disguises it from superficial observers and shallow thinkers. Spiritual and material are mere words, and words, as we have been told, are the counters of wise men and the money of fools. It is the thing, the conception, that matters, and the mechanical conception of cosmic evolution is atheism, under whatever form it may be disguised. Monism, too much emphasis cannot be placed upon this truth, admits of no breaks, allows for no interference, no guidance, no special providence. From star mist to planet, on through protoplasm to man, it asserts the existence of an unbroken sequence. If there are any gaps, they are in our knowledge, not in things themselves. The promise and potency of all subsequent phenomena is, for monism, contained in the primitive substance, whatever its nature may be. Every advance in scientific research is based, tacitly or avowedly, upon an acceptance of this belief. What place does the individual hold in such a conception of things? Clearly, he can be no exception to the general principle of causation. The same principle that accounts for the development of the species as a biological phenomenon must also explain the individual as a sociological or psychological product. Either the individual is the necessary product of his antecedents, or he is not. If he is, we have merely another phase of a general problem, only in a highly complex form. If he is not, then we have an absolute creation of something, a reintroduction of a disguised supernaturalism, and our scientific principle breaks down. The greatest genius, the most striking individual the world has ever seen, forms no exception to this universal principle of causation. Indeed, when the believer throws at the head of the atheist the names of Shakespeare or Beethoven and asks how can natural processes explain their existence, he is needlessly confusing the issue. First, because the problem of explaining the existence of a genius is no greater, fundamentally, than explaining the existence of the fool. Show me how to explain the complex processes that result in the existence of a penny a liner, and I will explain the existence of the author of Hamlet. The problem is substantially the same, whichever we take. And secondly, to take either the genius or the fool as a finished project and study him in isolation is emphatically not the way to set to work. We could not explain a man or an animal or a plant by such a method. Evolution ought to at least have taught us that the explanation of a thing is to be sought in its history. Behind the greatest musician and behind the greatest poet there lies that long history of the race leading to the rude rhythmical howlings and guttural ejaculations of the primitive savage, without which, as a starting point, neither poet nor musician would have existed. The greatest and the least of men are links in a chain of being, and can neither separate themselves from all that has gone before, nor from that which will come after them. I have put the claims of a monistic conception of nature as strongly and as plainly as possible in order to meet a challenge raised by a prominent clergyman in a recent issue of a religious weekly. We are told that the issue today lies between monism and Christianity, and monism is ruled out of court on account of its supposed depreciation of the individual. Even were this depreciation of the individual admitted, it might still be argued that the real value of any theory depends ultimately upon its truth. The argument from consequences is only valid if it can be shown that there are in obvious conflict with the facts. In that case, we should have to admit that our first principles were faulty and revise them accordingly. Facts are facts, and sooner or later we are compelled to deal with them. Theories may ignore them, but the consequences follow just the same. It is not merely our duty to face the facts, it is in our interest to do so. All life is an adaptation of organism to environment, and all healthy mental life is the expression of a harmony between our ideas of facts and the facts themselves. And without posing as a philosophical Gradgrind, one may confidently assert that the man or the philosophy that ignores facts will sooner or later come to grief. The article in question is headed, "Is the Individual Doomed?" And the answer is that he is, if monism prevails. With Christianity, we are told, the individual is everything. With monism, the individual is nothing. The Christian view of the individual acts as a powerful incentive to progress. The monistic view is utterly devoid of the dynamic which can generate any great social reform. While the conception of humanity as an organic structure in which the individual is ultimately merged is brushed aside in the following, quote, "The smallest and forlornest actual slum baby appeals to our sympathy immeasurably more than the vast, dim aggregate of indistinguishable items called the race. For we have actually met the slum baby, and we have never met, and what is more, we never shall meet, the race. No matter by how many times we multiply nothing, the result is still nothing. If we wish to be social reformers in earnest, we must take care of the individual, and the race will take care of itself." End quote. That the concrete example of a suffering slum baby appeals to us more than an abstract proposition about the race is true. But instead of this proving the case, it is, as will be seen later, dependent upon the fact of race and is only an illustration of its influence. And to say that we must take care of the individual if we wish to take care of the race is a mere ipse dixit, since the question at issue is whether or not we are best promoting the interests of the individual when we keep our minds steadily on the question of race welfare. Finally, when we are told that the conception of a man as a mere cell in the social tissue, an item in the long story of human progress, is devoid of the dynamic which can generate any social reform, the reply is that no other factor has shown itself of such inspiring force with social reformers. One need go no further back than the French Revolution of 1789, one of the most dynamic events of modern history, to prove this. The schools of St. Simon, Owen, Fourier, with the modern development of socialism on its higher side, all are permeated by a conception of human development that we are told is fatal to social progress. In fact, it is next to impossible to point to a great social movement that has not been inspired by the conception of humanity as a slowly developing organism from which the individual springs and in which the individual is ultimately merged. Our preacher may be correct in saying that with Christianity the individual is everything. He is quite wrong in saying that with monism the individual is nothing. The question is ultimately one of the nature and function of the individual. And to assume that unless we assert that he is independent of the social structure, we are destroying him is quite beside the point. We do not annihilate the Earth by showing its place in the solar system. We do not annihilate the cell by showing its place in the organism. Nor do we destroy the individual by showing him to be a cell in the social tissue. On the contrary, it is only when man is thought of in this sense that we really begin to form a genuine conception of individuality. One of the errors of Christianity has been to make constant appeals to the individual without considering those conditions of which individual life is the expression. It has preached purity of thought and deed while leaving untouched conditions that make purity of life an impossibility. It has taught morality without realizing that morality is not something that is grafted on life, but something that springs from social life and is conditioned in its expression by the prevailing social conditions. All the ethical failures and extravagances of moral teaching that dog the history of Christianity are attributable to this initial error. It may be quite correct to say that the Christian teaching is that we must look to the individual and leave the race to attend to itself, but it is nonetheless a mistaken teaching, for you can only permanently affect the individual through a modification of those conditions that are summed up in the phrase social environment. I do not mean here an environment that covers only the material conditions of existence, but include all those mental forces that play so large a part in the moulding of the life of each of us. If a man is to be morally, mentally, and physically healthy, he must live in an environment which permits health in all these directions. Otherwise, we may appeal to the individual as long as we choose. Our appeal, even in the most favorable of circumstances, will only be in the nature of a stimulant, and like all such will be of a temporary nature only. Doctors, scientists, sociologists, all shades of real thinkers, are fast realizing that it is the race problem that is the vital one, and this not in the interests of an abstract entity called the race, but in the best interests of the individual himself. In thus contrasting the monistic and the Christian views of the function of the individual, there is raised the old question of the relations of the individual to society. And although the limited influence of social conditions is admitted, the main position is that of a species of sociological atomism. Our preacher would agree with those writers who argue that society is a mere aggregate of individual human beings. On the other hand, one may submit that, while society is an aggregate of individuals, it is yet something more than is given in any number of individuals merely added together. The strength of an army is not the mere sum total of the strengths of the individual members composing it. It is that, plus the addition of what results from combination. The product of a chemical compound is not to be discovered by adding together the properties or qualities of its constituents. Some quality is given in the combination, not to be found in its constituent parts. And in the same way, no amount of adding together of individuals can give us all that we find in the social structure. We cannot, try how we may, derive society from the individual. We can, as will be seen, derive the individual from society. I am not claiming the existence of some mysterious social ego presiding over society, as theologians conceived a soul dominating the organism. My point is that just as I am made up of the various parts of my organism plus the combination of these parts, and that just as the relation between the parts are as real as the parts themselves, so there develops a social force which expresses the relations existing between all individuals, and which is as real as the individuals themselves. And this is strictly analogous to all that we know scientifically of other forces. The law of gravitation, the laws of heat, light, and sound are the expressions of a relation and have no existence apart from the relations between atoms of matter. And it would be absurd to deny the existence of gravitation, because it cannot be shown apart from matter, as it is to deny the existence of this social force, because we cannot separate it from the individuals that comprise society. It is perfectly true that, apart from individuals, society has no existence, but it is equally true that, apart from society, the individual ceases to be. Society is no more an abstraction than is the individual. When we speak of society, it is true that we are expressing the totality of individual actions, but it is also true that when we speak of the individual, we are expressing the result of a whole complex of social forces. Take from the individual all that society gives him in the shape of language, beliefs, clothing, institutions. Take away the relations existing between him and his fellows, and the individual, as we know him, has ceased to exist. One view of the case is certainly as true as the other, and when such opposing conclusions can be logically reached, it is highly probable that the truth lies between the two, or in a combination of both. The truth is that either aspect alone represents a one-sided view of the subject. Neither individual nor society can, or ought to be, considered separately. Both are aspects of the same fact. The individual is a concrete expression of social forces. Society is an organism precisely because, like all organisms, one cannot understand aright any one of the parts without considering its relation to the whole, and because one cannot appreciate the whole without understanding the nature and the function of each of the parts. One may reach the same conclusion by another method. Much is often made of the statement that the end of social action is the product of strong individuals. This is true, but individuation is the product, biologically, of a differentiation, and this, instead of making the part less dependent on the whole, really involves a greater coherence and a more profound interdependence of parts. In the animal organism, he taking on of specific functions by certain groups of cells involves the performance of other functions by other groups. And thus, while in view of a specific function, a particular cell group may be said to acquire a greater individuality. From another point of view, its individuality is an expression of the organized cell life of the entire organism. With equal truth, this generalization holds good of the individual in relation to society. Social action necessarily results not in the production of individuals who are above social forces and who control them, but in the production of individualities that express the highly elaborated social forces behind and around them. There is positively no other source for their existence. An individual cannot create new forces. He can only utilize those already existing. And unless he is the exact equivalent of all the forces that preceded him, neither more nor less, we have in the individual something that is impossible of explanation and which cuts the ground from under all scientific and all coherent thinking. The very feeling of the individual that he is controlling social forces is a trick of the imagination, which ultimately expresses the deeper truth I have indicated. The most striking apparent exceptions will be seen to enforce this truth. Probably, in thinking of strong, almost lawless individualities, many would light upon these money kings whose actions seem to be fettered by no consideration of social service. And yet, putting on one side that we are here dealing with the old predatory instincts modified to meet new conditions, the fact remains that the most lawless of the group are as dependent upon social forces as any others. For these men hold the wealth they have and pursue the methods they employ wholly in virtue of the social discipline, respect for private property, for freedom of action, habits of obedience, which the people have been subjected to, and to the laws, expressions of the same social discipline, which protects them from assault. So that, paradoxical as it may sound, the very people who imagine themselves free from the control of the social forces are those who are most dependent upon their existence and operation. We can now, I think, see more clearly the futility of the remark that, quote, the smallest and forlornest actual slum baby appeals to our sympathy immeasurably more than a vast dim aggregate of indistinguishable items called the race, close quote. Naturally, because we have here a concrete illustration of a universal fact, without which the general fact would not be appreciated. But the very sympathy which is excited is race-born, is an expression of that race solidarity which is thought of so little value. And sympathy, while immediately directed towards the individual, is ultimately directed towards race welfare. The love of the mother for her child is nature's method of securing race preservation, and the sympathy of one person with another is nature's method of securing that social cooperation and efficiency without which human life would cease to exist. It is always good not to lose the particular in the general, but it is also good not to lose sight of the fact that the particular is only what is because of its relation to the general. If what has been said be correct, what, it may be asked, becomes of the individual? Well, The individual is as much there as ever. We simply realize his true worth and function in the social organism. The individual is no more doomed than an analysis of the laws of light destroys the beauty of a sunset. We are as able as ever to appreciate the individual, but it is an intelligent appreciation that comes from a perception of his true nature and of his relation to humanity as a whole, in place of the unreasoning and helpless wonder of a disguised supernaturalism. The individual stands not as the chance product of incomprehensible powers, but as the necessary result and expression of social forces always in operation. That this conception robs us of the incentive to progress, I do not for a moment believe. In the first place, progress itself is not such a chance thing as to be dependent upon the voluntary cooperation of any one person or of any group of persons. Those who study carefully the history of ideas of progress in general will see the truth of Spencer's statement that human progress is all of a piece with the unfolding of a flower and the development of a planet, a complex illustration of the laws of causation. All ideas are born of the past operating upon the present. And although ideas cannot run without feet, they must find a particular human vehicle for their expression. Yet it is much nearer the truth to say that these find their vent in individuals than that individuals create the ideas themselves. Flattering to self-esteem as the notion that ideas depend for their existence upon this or that individual, it is one that is quite devoid of scientific foundation. Secondly, it is largely a question of how we are set to work. If the individual originates social forces, our efforts must be concentrated on individuals. Or, as it is said, we must take care of the individual and leave the race to take care of itself. If, however, the individual is the expression of countless social actions and reactions, then the line of effort must be in the direction of modifying social conditions so as to make for a more desirable manhood. And if we are to be guided by experience, one need have no hesitation in declaring for the latter method. For all experience testifies to the futility of our expecting ideas and beliefs to flourish in an unsuitable environment. Moral teaching is equally futile unless the general environment is such as gives it countenance. To do Christianity justice, one must admit that there has never been with it any lack of mere moral instruction, but there has been a fatal neglect of the conditions that would give the moral instruction force. A people is always what its environment makes it. Only we must be careful to count in the environment the biological and psychological forces along with the purely material ones. Finally, there is the question of inspiration. This is ultimately a question of imagination. Our preacher thinks the slum baby more effective than anything else. Others there are who find little inspiration in particular individuals, who may be quite unattractive objects. To them, the story of human progress appeals far more powerfully. They feel that, unlovely and undesirable as certain individuals may be, their unloveliness and undesirability are atoned for by the worthiness of humanity as a whole. It is not that they multiply nothing to get something, or that they hope by a multiplication of ugliness to get beauty, but the conception of a slowly developing humanity compensates for the partial failures and for the marred beauty of isolated instances. And surely there is in this human story, from caveman to poet, philosopher and scientist, enough inspiration to fire the most sluggish imagination. There is enough to make one feel that, whatever our failures may be, they are neither eternal nor irremediable, that the course of evolution has loaded the dice in our favor, and that even though as individuals we are mere links in the chain of beings, as links we still play our parts, and so serve to provide a finer metal out of which may be forged the links that follow. Spiritual vision. In one of his writings, Mr. G.K. Chesterton says that the real question at issue between the Christian and the freethinker is, Are there or are there not certain powers and experiences possible to the human mind which really occur when the mind is suitably disposed? Is the religious history of mankind a chronicle of accidental lies, delusions, and coincidences, or is it a chronicle of real things which we happen not to be able to do, and real visions which we happen not to be able to see? As is not unusual with Mr. Chesterton, he succeeds here in saying nothing in particular while apparently expressing a deal in a small compass. For, far from meeting the case of a scientific freethinker, it shows no real appreciation of it. Mr. Chesterton's case is that the Christian saint or the mystic is, by the exercise of certain spiritual experiences, brought into another world of being. The freethinker does not deny the experiences, without the qualifying spiritual, but he submits that there is another and more rational explanation at hand. Let us take a few examples. The Roman Catholic Church will produce clouds of testimony from men and women to the effect that certain visions were seen under certain circumstances. These circumstances are usually long vigils, fasting, praying, a more or less solitary life, and constant meditation upon mystical matters. These witnesses will dilate upon the feeling of exaltation that accompanied and preceded such visions, and will describe the subjective experiences with all the detail that one might use to describe a fit of indigestion or an attack of the toothache. Now, no free thinker who understands his case would say these witnesses were all liars, nor would he say that they were all insane in the general sense of the word. Neither would he deny that under the same conditions he himself would in all probability experience the same kind of visions and feelings. What he would say, and what he does say, is that all this religious testimony can be explained on pathological grounds as due to an unwholesome nervous strain. If any modern cares to try the experiment and sit, like some Hindu fakir, for so many hours per day contemplating his stomach and repeating the sacred word Om, we do not hesitate in saying that he too will see visions, and in that case he need not cite a cloud of witnesses. He can cite himself. So some notes then on Mr. Cohen, a remarkable writer, a writer whom I'm ashamed to say I'd never heard of until I found his writings in a collection of pieces on, it happened to be on atheism, but as you can see, a tremendous amount of useful information in there when it comes to causation and when it comes to behaviour and it comes to the source of morality and, if you like, human nature versus human behaviour. So let's run through a couple of the ones I wanted to point out. The most useful sentence I found in this about morality is the one which states that morality isn't something that's simply grafted onto social life, but is actually the offspring of social conditions. The demands of a religion or any similar institution upon a population for good behaviour, enjoining them to be good and moral and nice, while actually ignoring or even fostering the non-enablement of the conditions that give rise to harmonious moral behaviours, is a standard one. We could pick on the Catholic Church here, but I won't. Any of these moralizing religions that also feature phenomenal crimes of their own are almost a testament to this. It is very hard to demand moral behavior in a society that's structured to produce maximally amoral behaviors, or not maximally, that's an overstatement, certainly encourages the corruption which is preached against in the moral enjoyments of religion. Let's put it that way. We must love one another. We must, support other people, and we need to do all that. Of course, it's true. But if you have highly individualized societies in which it essentially becomes a you versus them for survival, how do you fulfill this human promise? Well, you can't really, unless you fix the value system until the value system is evolved to a point where that is actually a given, rather than just a wouldn't it be nice to have, and you really should be doing this. That kind of enablement is very key and is central to what we talk about. as one thing I've found when I've spoken to people who I know about the movement is if they're involved in things like social work or in actually sometimes economics as well, they get this stuff straight away. They find it not only obvious but interesting because they've seen over and over again the causative mechanisms at work, whereas an uninformed media consuming person will only see the good versus evil nonsense. And, oh, isn't it terrible, this man that, or this woman who's being portrayed, let's judge them. Let's have a nice, scary picture of them, and let's judge them as an individual. Well, you've just heard the monistic view of life, which is, albeit I'm using a religious metaphor here, but if everything is all interconnected, if values and morals and behaviors and judgments and crimes and efficiencies and everything comes from the interconnectedness of everything, there is no such thing as an individual committing a crime. It's the individual as a vehicle for criminal elements that are byproducts of the system that you're in, coming to the fore. These crimes don't have a name like Dave or Jared or whatever. These crimes are social ills, and that's an understanding that is as yet fairly lacking. Usefully put by Mr. Cohen. I also really like the element where he talks about how the cross-combined sum and aggregate of social organization yields more than its constituent parts. Now, this is worth comparing with Buckminster Fuller's work in Critical Path or Synergetics. You can see more of this. In fact, the quotation particularly referencing this from Fuller, I can give. I start a couple of paragraphs earlier to let it establish itself, so bear with me. This is Fuller from Critical Path. 1 2-mile diameter dome enclosing all the mid-Manhattan buildings between 22nd and 62nd Streets and between the Hudson and the East Rivers, having a surface that is only 1/84th that of all the buildings now standing in that midtown area, would reduce the heating and cooling energy requirements of that area 84-fold. The human pedal-powered airplane and the communication satellite are only 2 out of hundreds of thousands of instances that can now be cited of the accomplishment of much greater performance with much less material. The inefficiencies of automobiles' reciprocating engines and their traffic system wasted fuel and the energy inefficiency of today's buildings are only 200 of thousands of instances that can be cited of the design-avoidable energy wastage. But the technical raison d'etre for either the energy effectiveness gains or losses is all completely invisible to human eyes. Thus, the significance of their omni-integratable potentialities is uncomprehended by either the world leaders or the led. Neither the great political and financial power structures of the world, nor the specialization-blinded professionals, nor the population in general realize that sum totally the omni-engineering integratable invisible revolution in the metallurgical, chemical, and electronic arts now makes it possible to do so much more with ever fewer pounds and volumes of materials, ergs of energy, and seconds of time per given technological function that is now highly feasible to take care of everybody on Earth at a higher standard of living than anyone has ever known. Despite its focus, that's the end of the quotation by Buckminster Fuller, despite its focus on the metallurgical and energy and technical requirements, you can see that there is a surplus value that's understood to occur when you combine humans and systems into a society. It's not simply a society made up of individuals. As Chapman Cohen says, there's something that is greater, that is added through the combination process by all of this. And this is, of course, true of the values as well. And that's, I think, a key point. I think that's very useful. You can apply it either to values or to the technical side of things. It's most useful, I think, probably to apply it to both when talking about this, because I think on one side people think we're being airy-fairy if we only talk about values, and on the other side they think we're probably being overly mechanistic when we talk about only the technical abilities that are now afforded to us by our technological progress. So essentially we can express it that the surplus value of correct orientation and organization of a society according to technical efficiency and expediency of human requirements for life will be greater than the sum of all of its parts. It's a natural law version of profit, if you like, except that rather than leftover money, you have vast increases in output versus input, energy abundance, and a greater level of social harmony and life-oriented values. That's the real, true kind of profit, surely. It's the one where you're left better off than when you started, psychologically, physically, technically. I very much enjoyed also his mention of the money kings. This is something that I hadn't really comprehended in this particular way. I mean, we've always talked about how if humanity is going to be able to transition itself into a global, integrated system of abundance and real cooperation, rather than a one-party and one-state life, there would even, we normally say, and we try and express this to get people who think that they are winning in the current system, think that they are doing well on side. We essentially say, look, even the richest now won't have imagined the level of quality of life that would be available to even them compared to what they have now, because we are operating so suboptimally that even those with relative freedom in the system, those who are extremely rich, are still limited because they still breathe the same air, and they're subject to the same, most of the same crimes and natural disasters and weird shifts in governments and finances, relatively speaking. However, I hadn't fully really thought through the fact that the rich are just as conditioned as the poor. It's a sort of a decent insight. The dismissal of objections, for example, from those in the losing struggle of a society, people who complain must be not doing very well. This was leveled, of course, at the Occupy movement last year and the year before, where, this was just a load of unwashed hippies who aren't doing well, they're grudging, they don't want to work, they should get a job, right? Everything that would be the indicator of success in the current broken, corrupt system is leveled as their personal failure at not having. They lack those elements. Whereas, actually, it's a tacit admission of the reliance on the system by the rich, that their wealth comes from engaging with the artificial needs of that society. The brutal acquisitive nature, for example, that's rewarded has been reaped by some who followed that particular value set. It doesn't make them good or bad people. It doesn't make them people who particularly create wealth. All they're doing is playing by the particular rules, the arbitrary rules that exist. And of course their position is continually and in perpetuity upheld by the system functioning the way it does. This, of course, is a broad point we've made before, but it's rather nicely expressed by Cohen. So let's try and wrap all these thoughts into a coherent thread then, and draw it all together. We have seen, as usual, the various criminal failings of different people. And in fact, on a cultural level, it seems to happen on a country level sometimes as well. Large waves of protest, war, and all the rest of it. Given that we operate in a society that still somehow has the human nature idea embedded in it, most notably through law, which holds that people are responsible for their own actions and that they must be the source of those actions. You are guilty as a person and must be punished as a person. And whatever birthed you in terms of values doesn't get addressed at all. You just get thrown in prison, guaranteed to come out more damaged than you went in. So it makes sense that we see in the media and in general rhetoric and discourse, and most notably in political rhetoric, the argument that people need to have some responsibility of their own. This is where I, of course, differ with people like the libertarians, who say, well, actually, it's an individualistic society that we want. We want rugged individualism, and society will just be a collection of individuals. This is not a coherent argument. There is no such thing as a collection of just individuals. As we have seen, the combination of any set of human beings yields extra amounts. It yields further products than just having individuals by themselves. And of course, as we now understand, and as we've sort of really understood since before Cohen, because he didn't invent the idea, human values come from the society. One cannot understand the society by looking at one individual and extrapolating it out. One can, however, understand the individual as a product of the recombinations of that society. This has an extraordinary effect on every institution that we have, and is so far gone fairly unstated. If this is the case, which it is indeed, that human values are products of the society themselves, the whole edifice of law, the way it is, has to go. It's all based on the other way about. It's based on, you did this, we'll punish you, lock you away, and that's the end of it, and now what's the next crime that we have to pass judgment on? If we are to solve anything, it is to resolve and solve the basic issues that face our society and that inform human behavior and that give birth to that behavior that we then condemn in the next breath as being the fault of individuals. So, I will leave it at that, I think, actually. This has been Ben McLeish, and thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next week with more from other members of the movement. Thank you very much for listening.